Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fizza from class 60, and today I will be introducing this amazing book to you guys. So, I forgot. This is Mr. Snugglepuff, and he would be introducing this amazing book to you guys. So, shall we start? Let's begin. The title of this book is The Magic Finger, and the author of this book is Ronald Dahl. And the illustrator of this book is Quilton Blake. So, in the story, there is this girl who has a very, very, very special power inside of her finger. So let's see what it is. When someone makes this girl angry, then her right hand starts to tickle very, very hard, and she's red. Everywhere she sees red. And a sudden short flash come out of her, like something electric. It jumps out and touches the person who has made her cross. And the person will have some interesting and weird effects. So be afraid of this girl and never make her cross. So there are 5 characters in this story, and they are the girl, Philip Grigg, William Grigg, and Mr. and Mrs. Grigg. The farm next to hers is owned by Mr. and Mrs. Grigg. They have 2 sons, and they are Philip Grigg and William Grigg. The girl is 8 years old, and Philip is also 8 years old. And William is 11 years old. Last week, something very, very happened to that family, so let's see what happens. Now, the one thing that Mr. Grigg and his 2 boys loved to do more than anything was to go hunting. Isn't that bad? Every Saturday morning, they would go off with their guns and start to shoot at animals. That isn't a bad thing. So let's see what she says next. So, even Philip, who was 8 years old, had his own gun. Isn't that odd, Mr. Snugglepuff? Yes, this is a very bad thing to nature. Thank you, Mr. Snugglepuff. So, the girl would always try to stop them to do hunting, but they would make faces or say, "Go mind your own business." So, let's see what happened next. The boys laughed and made faces at her, just like I said. And she saw red, and she did it. And she never meant to do this. Then she put the magic finger on them all, even on Mrs. Grigg, who wasn't there. Poor Mrs. Grigg. Now, this is something very funny. Poor Mrs. Winter. One day, they were in class, and she was teaching up to spell stand up, and she told me to spell cat. Then I said K-A-T, cat. Am I right? Then the teacher said, "You are a very, very stupid girl." Then this made the girl very sad, and she said, "I am not a stupid girl." And then the teacher said, "Go and stand in the corner right now." And then the girl saw red. And then her right hand finger started to tickle very, very hard. And then she put the finger on Mrs. Winter and said, whiskers began to grow out of her face. They were long and black whiskers, just like my hair. They are black, right? And they are long, just like the ones you see on cats. ears. Of course, the whole class started to laugh at her. Then Mrs. Winter said, "You will be so kind as tell me, so what you find so madly funny about looking at me?" And when she turned around, they saw a long black tail, and it was a huge bushy tail. I cannot begin to tell you what happened after Mrs. Winter is quiet. All right now, the answer is number, and she never will be. The magic finger is something I have been able to do all my life. I can't tell you how I do it because I don't even know myself. So let's carry on Mrs. and Mr. Greg's family. So the afternoon of the very same day that I put the magic finger on the Greg family, Mr. Greg and Philip and William went out hunting once. This time they were going after wild ducks. So they headed towards the lake. In the first hour they got 10 birds. In the next hour they got another 6. So 10 plus 6, 16. Whoa, that's too much, right? What a day, cried Mr. Greg. This is the best day I was able to do with my sons. Then just 4 more wild ducks flew over their heads. They were just flying very low, so they were easy to hit. Bang, bang, bang went the guns. Late that night, after Philip and William have gone to bed, Mr. Greg went outside to get some wood to make fire because obviously it was cold. So he was crossing the yard when all at once he heard the call of wild ducks in the sky. He stopped and looked up. The night was very still. There were a thin yellow moon on the trees. On the hills and on the sky was filled with stars. Then Mr. Greg heard the noise of the wings flying over his head. So he was scared. Then he went back to his home and went to bed and sleep. The next morning, Mr. Greg woke up. He was the first to wake up. He rubbed his eyes, and when he wanted to see his watch, then he saw wings. And then he was very shocked. Then he went went to Mrs. Greg. Then Mrs. Greg says, "Oh dear, what happened?" Then she saw Mrs. Greg. Mrs. Greg was this big and Mr. Greg was this big. And then Mrs. Greg woke up. Then she saw wings. She screamed very loud, "Ah!" And then she ran to see Philip and William. And then they too were in the hall, flying around the hall. And then Mrs. Greg said, "Oh, my lovely sons, aren't you tired? Sit down now. It is dangerous." And then suddenly, lines of ducks came into their house, and the Greg family was very scared, so they flew out of the house, and then they found a nest in the tree, and then they sat down. And then the ducks started to play with William's toys, going to sleep in Philip's bed, and cooking in the kitchen as well. And then Mr. Greg noticed that they had our hands and we have their hands. Oh, sorry, I mean wings. So the girl was very panicked that what will happen next. Then she called them and said, "Hello," and there was a sound to her. "Quack, quack, 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 quack." The girl was confused, so she ran to their home and saw many ducks in their yard. And then she started to think, "Oh no, this must be the curse of my magic finger." And then she went running back to her home. And then, after all, Mr. and Mrs. Greg were very scared for the children. And then the ducks came with their heads up and coming to the yard. And then they were shooting. They were about to shoot William. And then they flew over the trees. And then they finally found a place that the ducks couldn't see them. And then finally, Mr. Greg used his brain and he built a nest for them all. But the problem was they couldn't eat worms and other insects. They are humans and they needed food, real food. So Mr. Greg found an apple that the whole family ate. And at last they went to sleep. And then the next morning, the curse was over. William, Philip, and Mrs. Greg were jumping off joy, and Mr. Greg was sweating off his sweat. And then they went to the girl and said, "We're sorry, you were right. We shouldn't hunt animals like this. If we hunt more, your curse will, and you see it, and then you will again put the magic finger on us. Now we know your superpower, and we will never do wrong things with animals." So Mr. Greg turned his surname to Mr. Egg. Isn't that weird, right? It is very weird. Oh my God, I heard this name for the first time. Yes, me too. So, and then they lived happily ever after. And they started to feed the homeless ducks and the hungry ducks. And they respected the animals just like they respect the humans. I learned that we should respect animals because something like this can happen to us again in real life. So beware of the magic finger and never mistreat birds or other animals. Just like I saw some kids kicking the birds all over when they are hatching the baby eggs. Isn't that bad? So we need to reduce this risk of the birds to die. Let's help the birds to live a healthy life just like us. We humans live a very healthy life, and we should also make the animals' life healthy. That's all. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Remember, you need to respect the